The bride vanished the night before the wedding, and the woman who took her place at the end of that flower-lined aisle wasn't a relative, wasn't a guest, but the gaunt housekeeper who'd been on her knees scrubbing the bridal suite floor upstairs. The ceremony was held at a grand estate on the outskirts of Chicago, 200 guests filling every seat, all of them underground elites, connected politicians, and alliance bosses. This wasn't a wedding. It was a power deal signed in white lace. Conrad Voss stood at the end of the aisle, 33 years old, tall, solidly built, wearing a three-piece black suit, a faded scar running from his left temple down near his ear, and a pair of steel blue eyes cold enough to make people forget how to breathe. He didn't love Monica Ashford, didn't even like her. But this marriage would merge two empires, and walking away meant war. Then 9 o'clock passed, 10 o'clock crawled by, and no one appeared from the bridal doors. When Genevieve Ashford stepped into the hall, her face white as chalk, her lips pressed into a razor-thin line, every person in that room understood something had shattered. Monica had run off with her personal bodyguard the night before. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Conrad. Pity, curiosity, and the most dangerous thing in this world, the scent of blood from a wounded man. Then Genevieve disappeared upstairs. When she returned, she was dragging a 27-year-old girl, dark brown hair pulled low behind her neck, skin pale from too little sun, calloused hands trembling inside a wedding gown so oversized it had been pinned together with safety pins and tape. Tessa Flynn, no papers, no family, nothing except what other people allowed her to have. She stepped into that hall like a ghost dressed in white, and 200 of Chicago's most powerful eyes waited for Conrad Voss to turn his back and walk away. But he didn't walk away. He stepped forward. If you want to know why the coldest boss in Chicago reached out his hand to a nameless housekeeper, hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with someone who needs a good story tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Conrad held out his hand, palm facing up, long fingers, calluses at the middle knuckles, the plain silver ring on his pinky glinting beneath the chandelier light. Tessa looked at that hand as if she were looking at a sentence she had no right to appeal. 200 people were watching, 200 breaths held still, and she knew that if she didn't place her hand in his Mrs. Genevieve would throw her out into the street that very night with empty hands and not a single piece of paper proving she existed in this world. She placed her hand in his. Her hand was small, cold, trembling so hard she was certain he could feel it. But Conrad didn't say anything. He only closed his fingers lightly around her hand, then turned toward the signing table, pulling her with just enough force for her to walk without having to decide the direction herself. The wedding took place in a heavy silence. No vows, no exchange of rings, no kiss in front of the guests. Only 2 white sheets of paper placed on a dark wooden table, and 1 fountain pen lying between them. Conrad signed first, his handwriting neat, quick, without hesitation, as if he had signed hundreds of contracts like this, and this was only one more. Then he pushed the pen toward Tessa. She picked it up, her fingers trembling so badly she had to hold it with both hands. The sound of the nib scratching across the paper was clearer than any promise any couple had ever spoken to each other in that room. Tessa Flynn, she wrote, and even she didn't recognize her own signature, because she had never signed her name on anything important before. Genevieve Ashford stood behind them, both hands folded before her stomach, and nodded only once, satisfied in the way of someone who had just saved a sinking ship by throwing someone else into the water in her place. Philip Ashford sat in the front row, his face gray as ash, his back more bent than it had been at the beginning of the morning, never looking so old before. He didn't look at Tessa, didn't look at Conrad, only looked down at the hands resting on his lap as if wondering when exactly the empire he had spent 40 years building had slipped through his fingers. The guests began to whisper. Tessa heard fragments of sentences drifting past her ears. The maid. See? Unbelievable. Conrad has lost his mind. But she didn't turn to look. She stood beside Conrad with her eyes fixed on the floor, the oversized wedding dress slipping down her left shoulder every time she breathed, and she kept using one hand to pull it up, while the other clenched into a fist at her side. After Conrad finished signing, he stood, buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, then placed his palm against the small of Tessa's back, not holding her, not pulling her, only a light pressure enough to say, "Let's go." He led her down the aisle between the 2 rows of seats, walking quickly, looking at no one, stopping for nothing. 200 pairs of eyes followed them until the hall doors closed behind them. Outside, the black car was already running, Conrad opened the car door, not in the polite way of a gentleman opening it for her, but in the way of someone who wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible. Tessa climbed into the car, the wedding dress rolling around her legs like waves, and she had to tuck each layer of fabric inside before Conrad shut the door. In the car, the distance between them was only a handspan on the black leather seat, but it felt as heavy as an entire concrete wall. Conrad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands resting on his thighs, his fingers tapping lightly against the fabric of his trousers in a steady rhythm that only people holding something back ever had. Tessa looked down at her own hand, the ink from the signing pen still staining her finger. She rubbed her thumb gently over the mark, but it didn't come off. 40 minutes in the car, and no one said a word. The city of Chicago slipped backward through the tinted windows, from crowded streets to wide avenues, then onto the northbound highway. Tessa didn't know where they were going. She didn't ask, because throughout the 27 years of her life, she had learned that people like her weren't allowed to ask where they were being taken. The car stopped in front of a black glass high-rise in Gold Coast, where 1 month's rent alone cost more than all the money Tessa had ever touched in the 27 years of her life. Conrad stepped out first, didn't open the door for her, didn't wait, only walked straight toward the lobby entrance, as if he had forgotten there was someone with him. Tessa struggled to lift the oversized wedding dress, stepped down onto the sidewalk in borrowed shoes far too large for her feet, then hurried after him through the glass doors. The doorman had already opened, without daring to look anyone directly in the face. The private elevator carried them to the top floor. When the doors opened, Tessa stepped into a space she had never imagined herself standing in. Dark marble floors stretched out like a frozen lake. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows looked out over Lake Michigan, its black water reflecting the city lights like millions of sparks sunk beneath the surface. Everything in this penthouse was expensive, from the black leather sofa to the dining table long enough for 10 people, though not a single chair looked as if it had ever been pulled out. Not one photograph on the wall, not one extra pillow on the couch, not one forgotten glass of water on the table. This penthouse wasn't empty. It was full of objects, but empty in the way of a place where no one truly lived, only existed. Conrad stopped in the middle of the living room and turned to Tessa for the first time since they had left the hall. He pointed toward the hallway on the right. "Your room, at the end of the hall." His voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. It was only fact, spoken in the voice of a man used to giving instructions. "Don't go into my office. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't go outside without someone with you." 3 sentences, 3 invisible walls rising around her. Tessa nodded, not because she agreed, but because she didn't have enough strength to do anything other than nod. Conrad looked at her for another second, as if checking whether she understood, then turned away and walked toward the office at the other end of the penthouse. The door closed behind him, and Tessa stood alone in the vast living room with the wedding dress dragging across the cold stone floor. She walked down the hallway, each step giving off a small echo against the marble, as if reminding her that she was moving through a home far too large for someone who had nothing. The bedroom at the end of the hallway had a queen bed made with perfectly white sheets, an empty closet, and a large window looking out over the Chicago night sky. Clean, complete, and cold as a hotel room no one had booked. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, the wedding dress swelling around her, then slowly collapsing. She had nothing to change into. No luggage, no purse, not one piece of clothing that belonged to her. Everything she wore belonged to a bride who had run away. She looked out through the glass. The city lights spread below like a glittering carpet she wasn't allowed to step onto. She counted in her head. Not the lights, but the number of times in her life she had been moved from one place to another without anyone asking whether she wanted to go. The first foster family, then the second, then the shelter, then the streets, then the Ashford house, and now this. The top floor of a building in Gold Coast, sitting on the bed of a mafia boss, whose wife she had signed her name to become 2 hours earlier. At the other end of the hallway, Conrad sat in his office behind the closed door, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The phone on the desk rang again and again, one name after another appearing on the screen, allies calling to ask what had happened, rivals calling to test whether he was weakened, acquaintances calling out of curiosity. Conrad didn't pick up. He turned the phone off, poured more whiskey, then sat in the dark, looking out through the glass at Lake Michigan. The lake below was black and still, just like everything inside him at that moment. Dark, silent, and no one was allowed to see the bottom. Tessa woke before dawn because her body didn't know how to sleep late. 8 years since leaving her last foster family, she had always been the first one awake in any house she lived in, not because she was diligent, but because she had learned that the person who woke first was the person least likely to be yelled at. She lay still on the bed for a few minutes, staring up at the high white ceiling above her, still wearing the wedding dress because it was the only thing she had on her body. Then she got up, removed the pins that had been digging into her skin all night, folded the dress neatly and placed it on a chair, wrapped herself in a spare bedsheet she found in the closet, and stepped into the hallway barefoot on the ice-cold marble floor. The penthouse was completely silent. Conrad's office door was still closed, and Tessa didn't know whether he had slept or was still sitting in there with a glass of whiskey like the night before. She found her way to the kitchen. The kitchen was wide, modern, with glossy black granite counters, a double-door steel refrigerator, and a 6-zone induction cooktop. Everything was so new it looked as if it had never been used. Tessa opened the refrigerator and found eggs, butter, an unopened loaf of bread, and ground coffee in a tin. Not much, but enough. Her hands began moving automatically before her mind had time to think. Crack the eggs, turn on the stove, place the pan down, add the butter, wait for it to melt, then pour in the eggs. She toasted the bread in the oven and made coffee with a machine she had to fumble with 3 times before finding the start button. The smell of hot butter, crisp toast, and coffee slowly spread through the kitchen, then drifted out into the hallway. She didn't cook because she wanted to impress him. She cooked because this was the only thing she knew how to do when she woke up in a house that wasn't hers. All her life, she had survived by making herself useful before anyone had the chance to ask why she was still there. She plated the eggs, set 2 slices of toast beside them, poured coffee into the only mug she could find, then stood beside the stove, both hands gripping the edge of the apron she had found in a drawer, eyes lowered, waiting. Footsteps came from the hallway. Conrad stepped out of the office, wearing a white shirt not fully buttoned, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair slightly disheveled, clearly not having slept. He stopped at the entrance to the kitchen, stopped completely. Tessa didn't look up, but she could feel him standing there, and she could feel the surprise inside that pause, because it lasted longer than normal. Conrad looked at the dining table, the plate of eggs still steaming, the toast evenly golden, the hot coffee in the mug. No one had set breakfast for him in this home since his mother died, and that had been 15 years ago. So long ago that he had forgotten what it felt like to walk out and see a meal waiting for him. He said nothing, only pulled out a chair and sat down. Tessa still stood beside the stove, gripping the apron tighter, as if preparing to hear a scolding or a question about why she had dared to use things in the kitchen without permission. But Conrad only picked up the fork and began to eat. No criticism, no praise, not looking at her. He ate slowly, bite by bite, in complete silence. Tessa stood there throughout the meal, didn't sit down, didn't eat with him, because she had never sat at the same table with someone she served, and she didn't know that the rules in this house might be different. When Conrad finished eating, he set the fork down, gently pushed the plate away, then stood. He had taken 2 steps toward the hallway when he stopped, his back still turned to her. "Thank you." Those 2 words fell into the kitchen as lightly as breath, but Tessa heard every syllable clearly. She looked up, but Conrad had already walked away, the office door closing at the end of the hallway, and she remained standing alone beside the still warm stove, her eyes blinking quickly several times because she couldn't remember the last time anyone had thanked her. After breakfast, Tessa washed the dishes, wiped the stove, then began cleaning the penthouse from the living room to the dining room, from the hallway to the windows. Not because Conrad asked her to. He hadn't said one word about cleaning, but Tessa didn't know how to exist in a house without serving someone, like a machine that only knew how to run one program, and if someone turned that program off, she wouldn't know who she was anymore. That afternoon, Conrad left the penthouse without saying a word. Tessa heard the elevator doors close, then stood in the middle of the vast living room, looked around, and did the only thing she knew how to do when no one was watching. She cleaned. She had found an old set of clothes in a drawer in the laundry room, an oversized gray shirt and black fabric pants that had probably once belonged to someone who had worked in this penthouse before her. The clothes didn't fit, but at least they weren't the wedding dress held together with safety pins. She began wiping the hallway, kneeling with a wet cloth, scrubbing each stretch of marble floor with hands far too used to this kind of work. The hallway was long, connecting the living room to the bedrooms, polished so brightly that it reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. Tessa wiped it meter by meter, moving backward little by little, head lowered, her mind empty in the way only people accustomed to physical labor understand. When the hands work hard enough for the mind to be allowed to stop thinking, she didn't hear the elevator open, didn't hear footsteps on the stone floor. Conrad had returned earlier than she expected, his black leather shoes crossing the dry part of the floor without a sound, and when he turned into the hallway, Tessa was kneeling in the wettest section with her back to him. She stood too quickly when she sensed someone behind her. Bare feet on wet marble. Her foot slipped. She lost her balance completely, her body tilting backward, her hands grasping at the air for something to hold on to. But the hallway was empty. Nothing there except walls and air. Conrad caught her before her back hit the floor. One hand held her elbow, the other braced her waist, pulling her back just in time. The movement was fast, precise, instinctive, like the reflex of a man used to handling everything in a split second before thought could catch up. Tessa gasped, her heart pounding hard from the shock, both hands unconsciously gripping his arm. Then she looked up. The distance between them was only a breath, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of sandalwood at his collar, close enough for her to see the scar on his left temple from a distance no one had ever been allowed to see, pale but long, running down near the edge of his ear, the skin there smoother than the rest, like a dry river drawn across a map. Her eyes met his, steel blue, sharp, but in that moment something flashed through them that she couldn't read in time, like a light flaring and vanishing before she could understand what it was. A few seconds passed, a few seconds too long for two people who shouldn't be standing that close. His hand still held her elbow, warm and firm. His other hand still rested at her waist, and Tessa realized she had stopped breathing without knowing when. Conrad let go first, not suddenly, not with a jerk, just releasing her, finger by finger, then stepping back half a step. He looked at her for one more second, then turned and continued down the hallway toward his office, as if nothing had happened, his steps steady, his back straight, not looking back. The office door closed. Tessa stood alone in the wet hallway, the cleaning cloth fallen at her feet, her chest beating faster than she was willing to admit. She looked down at her elbow, where the warmth of his hand still seemed to linger, then bent to pick up the cloth, knelt back down on the floor, and kept wiping as if, by scrubbing hard enough, she could erase that feeling before it had the chance to take root somewhere she had no right to let it reach. On the third day, Conrad left the penthouse early in the morning. For the first time, he said something to Tessa before leaving, not a greeting, only a brief notice tossed back over his shoulder as he stepped into the elevator. "I'll be home late." Then the elevator doors closed, and Tessa stood alone in the penthouse with an entire day stretching before her, wide and empty as Lake Michigan beyond the glass. She had already cleaned everything that could be cleaned the day before. The kitchen was spotless, the floors immaculate. The tables and chairs had been wiped until they shone enough to reflect the light. There was nothing left to do. And to Tessa, having nothing to do was more frightening than any heavy work, because when her hands stopped, her mind began to run, and her mind never ran toward gentle places. She walked slowly down the hallway, barefoot on the cold stone floor, past her bedroom, past the large bathroom, where she only dared use the cold water tap because she didn't know how to operate the complicated shower system, past Conrad's office, which she didn't dare look at for longer than 1 second. She walked like someone exploring a castle she didn't belong to, arms folded across her chest, touching nothing, only looking. At the end of the hallway on the left was a door Conrad hadn't mentioned in his 3 prohibitions. He had forbidden her from entering his office, forbidden her from opening the door for anyone, forbidden her from going outside alone. But this door hadn't been on any list. Tessa pushed it gently. The door opened. A reading room, smaller than the other rooms, with a lower ceiling, softer light, and bookshelves running along 3 walls from floor to ceiling. This was the only room in the penthouse that felt as if someone had actually used it, because Tessa could see books with cracked spines, pages turned yellow with age, and a small leather chair in the corner with a hollow in the seat like the trace of a body that had sat there hundreds of times. She didn't read the titles, didn't pull out any book, but her eyes stopped on the highest shelf, near the ceiling, where there was something that wasn't a book, a small old tin box, its edges rusted, placed behind the last row of books, as if someone had deliberately hidden it where it would be hardest to reach. Tessa didn't know why she pulled a chair over, stood on it, and reached for the box. Maybe because it was the only thing in this house that looked as if it had history, as if it belonged to a human being instead of a showroom. The box was light. She opened the lid. Inside, there was only one thing, a faded black and white photograph, its edges curled, the size of her hand. In the picture, a young woman was holding a baby boy in her arms. The woman had long black hair, a thin face but bright eyes, and she was smiling, the kind of laugh belonging to someone who didn't know she was being photographed, natural and radiant enough that Tessa could feel the warmth of that smile through the photo paper faded by time. The baby boy in her arms was giggling too, his mouth wide open, his eyes narrowed, his tiny hands clinging to his mother's collar. Tessa looked at the photograph for a long time. A very long time. She didn't need anyone to tell her who that baby was. Those eyes, even in black and white, she recognized them at once. This was Conrad Voss, before he became Conrad Voss. Before the three-piece suits, before the scar on his temple, before those steel blue eyes turned into the unyielding, frozen depths that commanded the frozen silence of any room he entered. This was the first proof, and perhaps the only proof, that the man who sat in the darkness drinking whiskey every night at the end of that hallway had once been a child held in someone's arms, had once laughed with his whole face, had once clung to his mother's collar with tiny hands, without needing to know that the outside world existed. Tessa placed the photograph back inside the tin box, closed the lid carefully, returned the box to the exact same place behind the row of books on the highest shelf, then stepped down from the chair, pulled the chair back to where it had been, and left the reading room. She closed the door as softly as she had opened it, leaving no trace that she had been inside. But the photograph didn't stay in the tin box on the high shelf. It followed her, imprinted itself into her memory, and remained there longer than anything else in this cold house. Because for the first time since stepping into the penthouse, Tessa saw Conrad Voss not as a boss, not as a husband on paper, but as a human being who had once had a mother, who had once known how to laugh, and who had hidden that memory in the highest place, where no one else's hand could reach. By the end of the first week, Conrad walked into the living room at 6 o'clock in the evening, already changed into a suit, cufflinks fastened, hair combed neatly, and said to Tessa in a voice that allowed no refusal, "Come with me." Tessa didn't ask where they were going. She had lived long enough in this house to understand that Conrad didn't explain, he only informed, and her role was to nod and follow. A day prior, Conrad had placed a black bank card on the kitchen table for her without saying anything except one sentence: "Buy what you need." Tessa took the card, went with a bodyguard to a shopping mall, and walked past dozens of stores displaying dresses priced at more than an entire year of her old wages, without stepping into a single one. In the end, she stopped at a small store on the lowest floor and bought exactly 2 outfits, one pair of jeans with a gray sweater, and one simple black dress, both among the cheapest items on the rack. Not because she didn't like beautiful clothes, but because she didn't believe she was allowed to spend someone else's money on herself, even if that person had given her the card. That evening, she wore the black dress into the elevator with Conrad. The dress fit, simple, nothing special. But it was the first time since the wedding that she had worn something that belonged to her instead of someone else. They arrived at an Italian restaurant in a southern neighborhood, its storefront looking ordinary, though there were 2 men guarding the back door whom Tessa knew at once weren't restaurant staff. Conrad placed his hand lightly against her lower back, leading her through the front entrance and inside. The restaurant was quiet, with only 4 or 5 men sitting at 2 tables in the back near the kitchen, all of them dressed in dark clothing, all of them looking up when Conrad entered, and all of them stopping when they saw Tessa walking beside him. She felt their eyes sweep over her like a cold draft. Not the way men looked at women, the way people evaluated, measured, and reached conclusions in their minds before their lips even had time to move. Contempt, suspicion, mockery. Tessa saw it all. She had been used to those looks her entire life, in every foster home, at every workplace, in every room she entered as the lowest person there. She lowered her eyes, clasped both hands tightly in front of her stomach, and prepared for the most familiar reflex she had: shrink, become smaller, become less, until no one bothered to look anymore. Then one of them spoke, his voice loud enough to carry across the empty restaurant. "Boss got himself a bargain." A low laugh came from the next table. Tessa stiffened. She didn't look up, but she felt her face burning and her fingers starting to tremble again. Conrad didn't turn around. He didn't look toward the back table. He didn't even stop walking. He only said, in an ordinary voice, not even half a tone higher than before. Not angry, not threatening, just a simple order, as if he were ordering food. "Get out." The restaurant went dead silent. The man who had spoken sat there for another second, then two, then pushed his chair back, stood, and walked out through the back door without daring to look back. No one at the remaining tables moved. Conrad pulled out a chair at the first table near the window, the best table in the restaurant, and looked at Tessa. "Sit down. You're my wife." Not gentle, not romantic, not a comfort. It was a declaration, spoken in the voice of a man who had never had to say the same thing twice in his life. And everyone in that room understood that from this moment on, the thin woman in the cheap black dress wasn't a maid, wasn't a replacement, but Conrad Voss's wife, and anyone who touched her touched him. Tessa looked at the chair, then at him. Then she sat down, and for the first time since entering this house, her hands didn't shake. Rumors spread through Chicago's underworld faster than fire. Less than 2 weeks after the wedding, the story that Conrad Voss had married the Ashford family's maid had become the subject of every drinking table, every closed-door meeting, every midnight phone call between men who were used to measuring power in territory and cash. Half of them believed Conrad had lost his mind. The other half believed this was the first sign of collapse, because in this world, a man whose bride had run away and who then hurriedly married a maid didn't look like someone holding power, he looked like someone trying to stay upright. And once the underworld smelled weakness, it reacted exactly like a pack of wild animals. It moved closer. Deals began to be delayed. A shipment that should have been delivered that week was pushed back without a clear reason. 2 meetings that had already been scheduled were suddenly canceled. The messages arriving with only the words, "schedule changed," and no further explanation. Small signs that outsiders wouldn't notice, but Conrad read each one the way he would read a battlefield report. They were testing him, measuring how much pressure it would take before he leaned. Then Philip Ashford called. Conrad looked at the name on the screen for 3 seconds before answering. Not because he wanted to listen, but because he wanted to know how reckless the old man had become. Philip didn't ask for anything. No concern, no proposal, no negotiation. He only said one sentence in the voice of a man who felt both pity and pleasure at watching someone else fall. "The whole city is laughing behind your back, Conrad." Conrad didn't answer. He ended the call mid-sentence, exactly as Philip was drawing breath to say something more, cutting the old man off with a long dial tone, then placed the phone face down on the desk. Then he sat there. The office was dark, with only the glow from the laptop screen lighting half his face, the scar at his temple sinking into shadow. He looked out through the glass at Lake Michigan, black and still as it was every night. But his hand was gripping the arm of the chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Outside in the hallway, Tessa passed the office on her way to the kitchen. She didn't stop, didn't glance through the crack in the door, but she felt it with the kind of sense only people who had lived long enough in other people's homes ever developed. The ability to read the air in a room without stepping inside. And the air from Conrad's office tonight was different from every other night. Heavier, thicker, like a storm turning slowly inside a sealed space. For the first time, Tessa realized that Conrad's silence had more than one kind. There was the ordinary silence, when he ate breakfast, when he read something on his phone, when he passed her in the hallway without looking. And there was the silence like tonight, the kind that made the whole room feel so heavy that even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. The kind where if someone knocked on the door at the wrong moment, no one knew what might happen. She had lived enough of life to know when to stay and when to disappear. Tonight was the time to disappear. Tessa cooked a simple serving of pasta, placed it on the dining table with a glass of water, didn't knock on the office door, didn't call him, didn't say anything. She only left the meal there like a small signal that someone knew he existed in this house, then retreated to her room, closed the door softly, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, the city was laughing behind Conrad Voss's back, but inside this penthouse, a nameless girl was quietly leaving dinner for him on the table every day without needing him to ask, and she didn't know that this was the only thing that week keeping him from smashing everything within reach. The following morning, Conrad placed a second bank card on the kitchen table. Tessa had used the first card to buy exactly the 2 cheapest outfits she could find, and Conrad hadn't said anything about it. But this morning he set the new card down with only one sentence. This time, buy enough. Tessa looked at the card, then looked at him, wanting to say that she didn't need anything more. But Conrad had already turned and walked into his office before she could open her mouth. She picked up the card. Light, thin, yet heavy in a way money couldn't explain. Because this wasn't only clothing, this was Conrad Voss telling her that she no longer had to wear other people's things, that she was allowed to have things that belonged to her. And even though he would never say it that way, the action had spoken for him. At 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 bodyguards took Tessa out of the building. One drove the glossy black car. The other sat in the back seat with her. Tessa immediately noticed that today there were 2 men instead of 1 like last time. And she didn't ask why, because she knew the answer was somewhere inside Conrad's heavy silence the night before. Inside the cancelled calls. Inside Philip Ashford's words over the phone. Something was changing outside the penthouse that she couldn't see, but she could feel it the way a person feels the smell of rain before the sky has time to break open. She bought quickly, didn't enter any large stores, and chose simple things that fit. 3 outfits, 1 pair of shoes, and a light coat. Still nothing expensive. But this time she chose what she liked instead of what was cheapest. And that was a small step forward no one recognized except her. On the way back, the driver looked into the rearview mirror longer than usual. Tessa saw his eyes change, from ordinary to focused, then to something sharper that she recognized at once as alertness. He turned sharply right onto a side street, then left, then right again. The bodyguard sitting beside Tessa slipped his hand inside his jacket, where she knew there was something she didn't want to think about. "We've got a car following us," the driver said, his voice low, calm, but loud enough for Tessa to hear. 3 blocks now. He picked up his phone and pressed 1 button. Tessa sat still, both hands gripping the shopping bag on her lap, her heart beating fast but her face showing nothing, because she had learned long ago that panic didn't help, and the person who panicked was usually the first one left behind. 10 minutes later, a second car appeared beside them at the intersection. The door opened, and Conrad stepped out. He opened Tessa's car door, looked at her, and in that moment Tessa saw something she had never seen on his face before. His face was cold, as always, his jaw clenched, the scar on his temple tighter than usual. But his eyes were different. Those steel blue eyes burned fiercely in a way coldness couldn't explain, like fire rising beneath ice. And Tessa realized this wasn't the anger of a man who had been insulted. This was the anger of a man whose something had been threatened. He took her back to the penthouse without saying a word in the car. When they got home, he checked every lock, every window, called someone in a low, fast voice Tessa couldn't hear clearly, then returned to the living room. He sat down on the sofa across from her, both forearms resting on his knees, leaning forward, and looked straight into her eyes. "Tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning." His voice didn't shout. Each word was heavy as lead, but not heavy toward her. Heavy toward something outside this penthouse that he was preparing to face. Tessa told him. From the moment she got into the car, to the first right turn, to the moment the bodyguard reached inside his jacket, to the black car appearing in the rearview mirror. Her voice trembled but stayed clear, leaving out no detail, adding nothing, exaggerating nothing. She told it like someone used to repeating the truth to people more powerful than herself. Precise and quick, because she knew they didn't want feelings. They wanted facts. Conrad listened until she finished, then looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Tessa almost lowered her eyes out of old habit, but she held his gaze, because somewhere during the past week, at the table in that Italian restaurant, in the sentence, "You're my wife," she had begun to believe she was allowed to look this man directly in the eyes without asking permission. Then Conrad said something she hadn't expected. "From now on, I'll teach you how to protect yourself." Tessa looked at him, certain she must have heard him wrong. She had prepared herself for many things, for an order forbidding her from leaving the house, for more bodyguards following her everywhere, even for a scolding because she had allowed herself to fall into danger. But she hadn't prepared herself for this. Conrad stood without waiting for her answer, because he wasn't asking, he was informing her. And Tessa had lived long enough in this house to understand that when Conrad Voss stood up, everyone else followed. He led her into the elevator, pressed the button for the basement, a floor Tessa had never even known existed. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a space completely different from the rest of the building. Gray concrete walls, white fluorescent lights, no windows, and at the far end of the room, a row of shooting targets hanging from a metal rail system. A private shooting range. Tessa stopped at the threshold. She had never touched a gun in her life. She had never held anything more dangerous than a potato peeler in the kitchen of the Ashford house. Conrad walked to the steel table in the middle of the room, opened a metal case, and took out a handgun. Smaller than Tessa had imagined, glossy black, solidly heavy in his palm. He checked it quickly, disassembled and reassembled it in one practiced motion, then turned to her. "Come here." Tessa stepped forward, her legs slightly stiff, her heart beating fast. But not because she was afraid of the gun. It was because she knew that in a few seconds, the man standing 3 steps away from her would have to touch her. And this time, it wouldn't be the reflex of catching her before she fell in a hallway. This time, it would be deliberate. Conrad placed the gun in her hand. Her hand was small, her fingers slender, the gun heavier than she had expected, and she almost let it slip downward. Conrad caught her hand in time, his large hand wrapping around her smaller one. Warm, dry, steady, shaping each finger into the right position on the grip. Then he stepped behind her. Tessa could feel the warmth of his chest near her back, not touching, but close enough that she felt each breath he took through the fabric of her clothes. His 2 hands rose and settled on her shoulders, straightening them, gently adjusting her balance, then slid down her arms, along her elbows, to her wrists, lifting her hands to the proper level. Every touch was brief, practical, meant for instruction, yet her skin flared at each point as though he had drawn a line of fire down her arms. "Keep your shoulders steady," his voice said right beside her ear, low, warm, so close that his breath brushed the loose strands of hair at the nape of her neck. "Don't fight the recoil. Let it move through you first, then pull yourself back." Tessa swallowed, nodded, and pulled the trigger. The shot thundered through the enclosed room, the recoil pushing her slightly backward, her back touching his chest for one brief second before she steadied herself again. The bullet missed the target completely and veered to the left. "Again," Conrad said, without disappointment, without encouragement, just one calm word. Tessa raised the gun a second time. This time, she held her shoulders more firmly, remembered the feeling of the recoil from before, and pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed the right edge of the target, closer, but still not a clean hit. Conrad adjusted her hand once more, this time saying nothing, only using one finger to nudge her elbow a few millimeters to the left. Tessa fired the 3rd time. It hit. Not the center, but it hit. She lowered the gun and turned to look at him. Conrad stood right behind her, half a step away, his steel blue eyes fixed on her with a look Tessa had never seen before. Not pity, not control, not obligation. He nodded. Once, he said nothing, but Tessa had been in this house long enough to understand that a nod from Conrad Voss wasn't something he gave easily. It was worth more than 1,000 words of praise from anyone she had ever served, because it wasn't charity, it was recognition. And for the first time in 27 years of life, Tessa Flynn felt that she wasn't merely existing inside someone else's house. She was beginning to belong somewhere, even if that somewhere was a shooting range beneath a building in the Gold Coast, with a mafia boss standing behind her, exactly half a step away. The bouquet arrived at noon, just as Tessa was standing in the kitchen washing dishes. The doorbell rang. The bodyguard on duty outside opened the door, then carried in a large bouquet of white flowers wrapped in tissue paper and placed it on the living room table. Tessa wiped her hands on a towel and stepped out to look. White lilies, dozens of them, arranged with careful precision, so beautiful they looked as if they belonged to a special occasion. But the scent was too strong, too sweet. Sweet in a way Tessa remembered at once, because she had smelled this fragrance before, at the funerals she had served when she was still working for the Ashford family. These were funeral flowers. A small card was tucked between the petals, written by hand in neat, slanted handwriting, condolences to the new bride. Tessa finished reading it, and felt cold spread from her fingers up her arm and down into her stomach, a kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She didn't know who Pierce Lawton was, didn't know which face that name belonged to among the hundreds of faces in the world Conrad lived in, but she understood immediately that this bouquet wasn't a gift. It was a threat wrapped in tissue paper. Conrad came home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He stepped inside, saw the bouquet on the table, and stopped. Tessa stood beside the kitchen, watching. He walked to the table, pulled out the card, and read it. His face didn't change, not a frown, not a tightening of the lips, not a single expression slipping past the layer of control he had built over an entire lifetime, but his hand was different. Tessa saw his fingers close around the card, slowly, firmly, until the piece of paper was completely crushed in his fist, and then he dropped it to the floor as if he were dropping a dead insect. He turned to the bodyguard standing near the door and said something low and quick that Tessa couldn't hear clearly. The bodyguard nodded, then carried the bouquet outside. Conrad went straight into his office, closed the door, and didn't come out for the rest of the afternoon. He didn't say a single word to Tessa about the bouquet. No explanation, no reassurance, no telling her who had sent it or why. His silence this time wasn't like the heavy silence of the night Philip called. This time, the silence had a different shape, sharper, stiller, like the surface of water before it began to swirl. Tessa cleaned the kitchen, cooked dinner, set his portion on the table, then withdrew to her room. She lay on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and listened. At 10 o'clock at night, she heard Conrad's footsteps passing through the hallway. At 10:30, she heard the elevator doors close, then silence. He had gone out. Tessa didn't sleep. She lay there, looking into the dark, listening to the low hum of the city below through the thick glass, and waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the elevator opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the stone floor of the hallway, slower than usual, more dragging than usual. Tessa sat up in bed and listened. The bathroom door opened, then closed. Water ran, then silence returned. She got up, opened her bedroom door very softly, and stepped barefoot into the hallway. Through the narrow gap of the bathroom door left slightly open, she caught a glimpse of Conrad's white shirt thrown on the tile floor. There were dark stains on the white fabric, and she didn't need to look closely to know they weren't coffee or wine. The knuckles of his right hand were bruised, slightly swollen. The skin scraped across the second and third knuckles. Tessa didn't knock. She didn't ask. She didn't look any longer. She returned to the kitchen, boiled a kettle of hot water, poured it into a small basin, placed it beside a clean towel, folded neatly, then carried everything into his room and set it on the table beside his bed. She didn't leave a note, didn't write anything, didn't wait. She simply placed the basin of warm water and the towel there, then returned to her room, closed the door gently, and lay back down on her bed. When Conrad stepped out of the bathroom, he saw the basin of water on the bedside table. Steam was still rising faintly into the cold air. The white towel was folded into a neat square beside it, orderly, careful, the way someone accustomed to caring for others did things without needing to be asked. Tessa wasn't there. The room was empty. She had come and gone, without leaving a single footprint on the marble floor. Conrad stood looking at the basin for a long time, longer than necessary to understand what it was, long enough for the steam to stop rising and the surface of the water to become completely still. It was the gentlest thing anyone had ever done for him without demanding anything, without expecting anything, without staying to receive a thank you or a nod. Just a basin of warm water in the cold night, placed there by someone he had never asked to stay, yet she had stayed anyway, and he began to wonder when that had become so important. The next morning, Tessa woke up and realized the penthouse was quieter than usual. There was no sound of the office door opening and closing, no quick footsteps in the hallway, no sound of Conrad saying something brief into the phone before leaving the house the way he did every morning. She stepped out of her room, walked down the hallway, and saw him. Conrad was sitting on the living room sofa, not upright the way he usually sat, but leaning back, his head resting against the back of the couch, his legs stretched out, his eyes open but fixed on the glass doors in the way of someone who wasn't truly looking at anything. He hadn't changed clothes. He was still wearing the dark trousers from the night before, with only a white t-shirt on his upper body, and no shoes on his feet. His right hand rested on his thigh, the bruised and swollen knuckles even more visible in the daylight. The scraped skin over the two middle knuckles already scabbed over but still red. The basin of water Tessa had left on the bedside table the night before had been used. The white towel now lay folded on the kitchen counter, slightly damp. He had used it, but he hadn't said anything, and Tessa hadn't expected him to. She stood at the head of the hallway and looked at him for about 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she read many things Conrad would never say out loud himself. The way his shoulders curved forward, instead of staying straight as they always did. The way his uninjured hand rested on the arm of the sofa but didn't grip it, only hung there. The way his eyes were open but empty, like a room with the lights on and no one inside. She had seen this kind of exhaustion before, not in Conrad, but in herself, on the nights when she lay inside an abandoned car in the middle of winter and wondered whether waking up the next morning was even worth it. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that belonged to the body. It was the tiredness of someone who had carried too much for too long, and no one had ever asked him whether he wanted to set it down. Tessa didn't ask if he was hurt. She had seen his hand. She knew the answer. And she also knew that Conrad Voss wasn't the kind of man who wanted to hear that question, because it sounded like pity, and he hated pity more than he hated any enemy out on the street. She didn't get a towel, didn't bring water, didn't cook anything. Last night, she had done her part, the basin of water and the towel. And she understood that repeating it this morning would turn it into a duty instead of what it truly had been. She said nothing, not a word. She simply walked quietly across the living room, barefoot on the cold stone floor, went to the sofa, and sat down at the other end, nearly 1 meter away from him, close enough for him to know she was there, far enough for him not to feel invaded. Then she sat still, looking through the glass doors in the same direction he was looking, out toward Lake Michigan, reflecting the silver-gray light of early morning. She didn't look at him. She didn't wait for him to look at her. She didn't wait for him to say anything. She was simply there. Conrad didn't turn toward her. He didn't ask what she needed. He didn't tell her to leave or to stay. But after a few minutes, something began to change in the way he sat. Not a large change. Not that he suddenly smiled or sighed or said some sentence that changed the whole story. Only that his shoulders lowered, slowly, gradually, like a man finally setting something heavy down from his back without needing anyone to help him, only needing to know that someone was sitting beside him while he did it. 10 minutes passed. 20 minutes. No one said anything. No one moved. The gray light beyond the glass slowly turned pale gold as the sun climbed higher behind the buildings along the horizon. No one had ever done this for Conrad Voss. No one had ever simply sat beside him without wanting anything. Not money, not power, not protection, not an explanation, not a promise. Just stayed beside him, silent, letting him know he wasn't sitting alone in this room. That was the thing he had expected least of all. Not the funeral bouquet, not Philip's phone call, not the men tailing the car through the streets, but the thin girl sitting at the other end of the sofa in the early morning, barefoot, hair tangled, silent, asking for nothing, and somehow the only person in this world who made him feel that he was allowed to be tired without having to hide it. The envelope arrived in the afternoon, not through the mail, but delivered by a man in a gray suit directly into the hands of the bodyguard on duty in the ground floor lobby. The envelope was thick, brown, with no sender's name written on the outside, but Conrad knew at once where it had come from, because there was only one person in this world reckless enough and desperate enough to send something straight to his home without going through any middle channel. Philip Ashford. Conrad opened the envelope in his office, alone, with the door closed. Inside was a file about 20 pages thick, white paper, sharply printed, arranged in chronological order, as though someone had spent a great deal of effort and money digging through the life of a girl whom no one in the world had cared enough to notice 3 weeks earlier. The first page was an old identification photo. Tessa Flynn, 19 years old, hair cut short, face thinner than it was now, eyes looking straight into the camera with the gaze of someone who had grown used to being photographed by people who didn't ask for permission. Beneath it was a county police record, a minor arrest at a supermarket for stealing food, 2 boxes of cereal, 1 bag of apples, and 1 carton of milk. Not theft out of habit, but theft out of hunger, and anyone reading that file would understand it. But Philip hadn't attached the context because he didn't need the reader to understand. He needed the reader to despise her. The next page was a report from social services, recording that Tessa Flynn, 19 years old, had lived inside an abandoned sedan on a vacant lot west of Chicago for 4 winter months, had been found by a patrol officer when the temperature dropped to 15 below zero, had been brought to a temporary shelter, then disappeared from the record 6 weeks later. And the final page, the page Philip had certainly placed at the end on purpose, so that it would be the thing that lingered the longest, was a family court record, loss of custody. The reason written in the file was brief and cold, like every legal document. Insufficient stable income, no fixed residence, failure to meet minimum standards. The typed lines on white paper didn't know that they were summarizing the greatest tragedy of a human life in administrative language. Clipped behind the file was a small handwritten note, Philip Ashford's handwriting, slightly trembling with age, but still sharp. "This is the person you married. This whole world will know." Conrad read everything, every page, slowly. Then he set the file down on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and looked up at the ceiling. He wasn't surprised, not because he was heartless, but because he had already known all of this since the first week after the wedding. On the second day, when Tessa was still wiping the kitchen with an old towel and sleeping in her wedding dress because she had nothing else to change into, Conrad had called his people and ordered them to investigate everything about her. Not out of curiosity, not out of suspicion, but because it was instinct. In his world, not knowing about the person living inside his house meant leaving his side exposed for enemies to stab into, and Conrad Voss never left his side exposed. He had known about the stolen food. He had known about the winter sedan. He had known about family court. He had read every line, every detail, and had stored all of it inside his head, without ever mentioning it once to Tessa, because he saw no reason to mention it. She stole because she was hungry. She slept in a car because she had nowhere else to go. She lost custody because this world punishes the poor more harshly than it punishes the wicked. There was nothing in that file that made him look at her differently, because Conrad understood better than anyone that the past didn't define a person. Their actions in the present did. And the girl who had left a basin of warm water beside his bed at 3 o'clock in the morning without demanding a thank you had told him more about who she was than any file ever could. Conrad picked up his phone, opened a message, typed one single line to Philip Ashford. "Do you think you're telling me something new?" Then he turned the phone off, placed it face down on the desk, and looked back at the file lying on the surface before him. He didn't burn it, didn't tear it apart, didn't throw it away. He simply placed it inside a drawer and locked it. Because one day Philip Ashford would understand that the weapon he had believed to be his sharpest was actually the most useless thing of all, because you can't use someone's past against a man who has known that past for a long time and still chosen to keep that person close. It happened the following afternoon, completely by accident, with no one arranging it, no one setting it in motion, and perhaps that was exactly why it struck Tessa harder than any blow life had ever dealt her. Conrad left the penthouse at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, more hurried than usual, his phone pinned between his shoulder and his ear, his voice quick and low as he stepped into the elevator. He didn't turn back to look. He didn't say, "I'll be home late," the way he usually did. He simply disappeared behind the closing elevator doors and left the penthouse in silence. Tessa waited 10 minutes, then began cleaning by habit, from the kitchen to the living room, wiping the table, straightening the sofa cushions, then walking down the hallway. As she passed the office, she realized the door was slightly open. Conrad always closed this door. Always. Every time. Without exception. But today, he had been in such a hurry that he had forgotten. Tessa didn't intend to go in. She clearly remembered the 3 things he had said on the first day, and "Don't enter my office" had been the first one. But through the narrow gap in the door, she saw the pale blue light of the laptop screen spilling across the desk, and her eyes, before she could command them to look away, had already read the words on the screen. An email window was open, the most recently sent message sitting right at the top of the page. Recipient: Philip Ashford. The message contained only one line. "Do you think you're telling me something new?" Tessa stood there. Her feet stuck to the marble floor as if someone had poured glue beneath her heels. She read the sentence the first time and didn't understand. She read it the second time and began to understand. She read it the third time and understood completely, and that understanding crashed down over her so heavily that she had to reach for the doorframe to keep her balance. Something new. That meant he had already known the old things. It meant Philip had sent him something about her, and Conrad had read it, and Conrad had answered that he already knew, from before, from a long time ago. He had known. Tessa felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, even though the marble remained perfectly flat. He knew she had stolen 2 boxes of cereal and 1 carton of milk from a supermarket when she was 19 years old. He knew she had slept inside an abandoned sedan for 4 winter months. He knew she had once been a mother, and then had no longer been allowed to be one. He knew everything, from the beginning, and he had never mentioned it. Not once. He hadn't used it to remind her that she owed him. He hadn't used it to keep her there through shame. He hadn't used it against her when she placed a basin of water beside his bed, or when she sat beside him on the sofa that morning. He had simply known, and stayed silent, and allowed her to live in this house in whatever way she chose, never once making her feel that she was living beneath the pity of the man who held her secrets. Emotion rushed through her like floodwater breaking through a dam, out of order, without warning. Shame came first, hot and bitter, because everything she had hidden for years had been laid bare before the man she ate breakfast with every day. Then fear, Because if he knew, anyone else could know, and she had thought she had buried that past deeply enough. Then gratitude, a strange and painful kind of gratitude, because he had known and still pulled out her chair at the restaurant, still drove away the subordinate who insulted her, still taught her to shoot, still said, "You're my wife," in front of the most dangerous men in Chicago. And finally, something else, burning in her chest, deeper than gratitude, larger than shame, something she didn't dare name, because naming it meant admitting that she was beginning to feel something for Conrad Voss that wasn't written into any agreement, wasn't contained in any signed paper, and wasn't something anyone had forced her to feel. Tessa closed the laptop gently, carefully, folding the screen back down into its exact place. Then she left the office, closed the door to precisely the same narrow opening in which she had found it, and walked back to her room. For the rest of that evening, while they remained wrapped in their tight silence, Tessa picking at her dinner alone in the kitchen, while Conrad was back out in the city, she didn't say a single word. Not because she was angry, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to find a way to keep living with the truth that, for the first time in her life, someone knew every worst thing about her and still hadn't turned away. Nearly midnight, Tessa stepped out of her room. She had been lying on the bed for 5 hours since retreating to her room after dinner, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, turning the same question over and over until it had worn down every other thought in her mind. He knew from the beginning. Why didn't he say anything? She walked down the hallway barefoot, the stone floor bitterly cold. But she didn't feel it, because what was burning inside her chest was hotter than any cold outside. The living room was dark. Only the city lights spilled in through the glass, drawing long streaks across the stone floor like roads leading to where Conrad was sitting. He was seated in the single armchair beside the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, half full and half empty, his eyes fixed on the black surface of the lake. He didn't turn when he heard her footsteps, but he knew she was there, because Conrad Voss always knew who was in the room with him, even when he didn't look. Tessa sat down in the chair across from him, not the sofa where she had sat beside him that morning. This time, she chose to sit opposite him, because the conversation ahead needed them to look at each other. She sat still for a while, her hands clasped together in her lap, her fingers squeezing so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then she spoke, her voice low, trembling slightly at the edges of each word, but she didn't lower her eyes. "You knew from the beginning. Why didn't you say anything?" Conrad didn't deny it. He didn't ask what she was talking about. He didn't pretend to be surprised. He only looked at her through the darkness, the glass of whiskey stopping halfway to his mouth, then lowering to rest on the arm of the chair. His silence was the answer, because there was no denial in it, and that very silence gave Tessa enough courage to continue. She told him. Not because he didn't already know, but because she needed to say it herself, in her own voice, with her own words, instead of letting the cold lines in a file speak for her. "I stole because I was hungry. 2 boxes of cereal and 1 carton of milk. I hadn't had anything in my stomach for 3 days. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. Not yet. I slept in an old sedan for an entire winter because nowhere would take me. The shelter was full, and I didn't have enough paperwork to rent a room." She swallowed, and Conrad realized that her fingers were clenched so tightly her knuckles were trembling in small waves. "And I was a mother once." Her voice broke there, truly broke, not cracked, but snapped, like a dry piece of wood that had carried too much weight and finally split in silence. "I was a mother before the system decided I wasn't qualified." She stopped. Tears fell, but she didn't wipe them away, because wiping tears in front of someone else meant admitting she was crying, and Tessa was used to pretending she didn't hurt. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave. I'm used to it." The last sentence fell into the room as lightly as a leaf, but it was heavier than anything she had ever said, because it was the barest truth Tessa Flynn had ever placed in front of anyone. She was used to being left behind, so used to it that she offered first, so she wouldn't have to wait for someone else to do it. The silence stretched on, so long that Tessa thought he wouldn't answer. Then Conrad set the glass of whiskey down on the side table beside the chair. The sound of glass touching wood was soft, but it echoed through the dark room like the strike of a hammer. He no longer looked out the window. He looked at her. "My mother endured my father for many years." His voice was low, calm, but Tessa heard something buried deep beneath that calm, heavy and dark and hidden for a very long time. She endured it until she didn't have any strength left. "She died when I was 18. He stopped, not to catch his breath, but to decide whether he wanted to keep speaking. Then he continued, because she had placed her truth on the table, and he owed her at least that much. When I was old enough to stand up, I ended it. That's why I entered this world. Tessa didn't ask what ended meant. She didn't need to ask. She looked at the scar on his temple in the darkness, looked into the steel blue eyes that she now knew had seen things no child should ever see, and she understood. "I'm not a good man," Conrad said, his voice offering no apology, no excuse, only the truth. "But I don't judge anyone for what they had to do to survive." He stood, slowly, surely, crossing the darkness between the two chairs until he stood in front of Tessa. She looked up at him, tears still on her cheeks, her eyes red, her lips pressed tight to keep her jaw from trembling. Conrad reached out, his fingers settling beneath her chin, light but steady, lifting her face until her eyes met his completely. This was the first time he had touched her face. This was the first time he made her look at him not with an order, but with gentleness. "You're not going anywhere." 4 words, no promises of the future, no vows, no romance. Just 4 words spoken in the voice of a man who had never said anything he didn't keep. And Tessa believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had lived long enough in this house to know that Conrad Voss didn't speak unnecessarily, didn't promise unnecessarily. And when he said something, it became true through sheer will. The first kiss wasn't gentle. It happened when Conrad leaned down and Tessa lifted her face, when the last distance between them collapsed, not because anyone had planned it, but because both of them were tired of keeping that distance there. His mouth touched hers with the taste of whiskey and the salt of tears, and that kiss wasn't romance. It was the desperation of 2 people who had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen by someone. Tessa gripped the front of his suit jacket with both hands, tightening her hold, pulling him closer, and Conrad placed one hand on her waist and drew her up from the chair until she stood before him, and the second kiss was deeper than the first. No more hesitation, no more restraint. When they pulled apart, forehead against forehead, their breaths mingling in the dark, Tessa knew that what had just happened had changed everything. This was no longer a marriage on paper, no longer a duty, no longer an arrangement between a mafia boss and a maid forced into a wedding dress. This was a choice, for both of them, and for the first time in her 27 years of life, Tessa Flynn didn't feel as if she was being allowed to stay. She felt wanted. The next morning, everything was different. Not different in a loud way. Not the kind of different where someone wakes up in a brand new world with music playing and golden light blazing everywhere. It was only that when Tessa stepped out of her room at 6 o'clock in the morning, barefoot on the familiar stone floor, and saw Conrad already standing on the balcony with a cup of coffee in his hand, she didn't stop at the threshold the way she always had. She didn't stand there waiting for him to say something, didn't wait for him to give her a signal, didn't wonder whether she was allowed to step into his space. She simply walked out onto the balcony and stood beside him. That was all. But it was the first time she had done it without being invited, and both of them knew there was nothing simple about it at all. Conrad didn't turn to look at her. He didn't say good morning, didn't ask if she had slept well, didn't mention anything that had happened in the dark living room the night before. He only stood there, steam rising from the coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on Lake Michigan as it shifted from black to silver gray beneath the dawn. But he didn't step aside to keep distance between them. He didn't move his shoulder. He didn't make even the smallest motion to remind her that she was standing too close. The space between their shoulders was narrower than it had been yesterday, perhaps only the width of one hand, and both of them left it there, neither closing it further nor opening it wider. The silence between them this morning was completely different. It was no longer sharp, no longer heavy, no longer a wall they both had to speak through or climb over. The silence this morning was soft, like Lake Michigan below them, still but wide, with enough room for both of them to exist inside it without having to explain anything. Tessa drew in a long breath. The early Chicago air was cold and carried the smell of lake water, of the city, of mist. For the first time since she had stepped into this penthouse, she felt as though she was truly breathing, instead of merely taking in enough air to survive the next moment. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The sun rose behind the buildings along the horizon, scattering pale gold across the lake, across the balcony, across the 2 people standing side by side in silence. Then Conrad's phone vibrated. He pulled it from his trouser pocket with his left hand, looked at the screen, and Tessa saw his face change. Not a large change, because Conrad wasn't the kind of man who let emotion show easily. But she had learned to read the smallest shifts on his face, the way one reads weather across the surface of a lake. His jaw tightened. His steel blue eyes narrowed a little more. The fingers holding the phone clenched until his knuckles turned white. He placed the phone face down on the balcony railing. The screen turned toward the metal surface, but he was 1 second slower than necessary. And in that 1 second, Tessa had seen it. An article headline, black letters on a white background, clear on the phone screen beneath the early morning sun. She couldn't read all of it, but she read enough. Mafia boss marries homeless petty thief. Beneath the headline was a photograph of her, taken secretly from a distance, slightly blurred, but clearly her, walking out of a clothing store with a small bag in her hand, a bodyguard behind her. Tessa felt the ground vanish beneath her feet, not as a figure of speech. She truly felt the balcony tilt, the city turning slowly, and she had to reach for the railing to steady herself. The past she had buried deep, had left behind in that winter sedan, had locked inside court records, was now being displayed before the eyes of the entire world by someone she had never even met, Pierce Lawton. The name she had read on the card tucked into the funeral bouquet. The man who had sent condolence flowers hadn't stopped at flowers. He had dug everything up. The criminal record for stealing food, the homelessness report, the social services file, and spread it across the internet, across the press, across every place anyone would see if they typed Conrad Voss's name. Conrad remained still. He didn't look at her, didn't explain, didn't reassure her, but his left hand rested on the balcony railing, less than 10 centimeters from hers, and Tessa saw that his knuckles had gone bone white from gripping the metal too tightly. He wasn't angry because he had been humiliated. He was angry because someone had just touched something he had decided to protect. And in that moment, standing on the top floor balcony in the Gold Coast, with early morning sunlight falling across the lake and the article headline still burning inside her mind, Tessa realized that the real war had only just begun. 3 days after the morning on the balcony, Tessa stopped leaving the bedroom during the day. Not because Conrad forbade her. He didn't say anything about it. She locked herself away because every time she picked up her phone, the world outside pushed another knife into her chest. The first article gave birth to a second, then a third, then dozens more, each one digging deeper than the last, each one dissecting her more carefully, as if she were a case file and not a human being. The photo secretly taken of her while she was shopping was cropped, edited, enlarged, then placed beside photographs of Conrad in a black suit at previous events, with headlines written to shock. The comments underneath were even worse than the articles. Tessa read all of them, line by line, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't stop, like someone staring at a wound on her own body, and unable to look away even though she knew looking would only make it hurt more. They called her a thief, a gold digger, a lucky homeless girl, the joke of high society. They dug up her old photo from the police file, 19 years old, short hair, thin face, eyes looking straight into the camera, and placed it beside the recent photo of her at the shopping mall, with the caption, "Before and after landing a rich man." Tessa turned off her phone, then turned it back on, then off again, then on again, because she wanted the pain to stop, but didn't know any other way, except to keep reading until the pain became numb. She watched Conrad come and go every day and saw him change, not in the way she feared. He wasn't colder toward her, wasn't more distant, didn't look at her with different eyes, but he became harder. The expression on his face when he stepped out of the elevator each evening was like a steel shield. No cracks, no openings, no emotion. Only the absolute control she knew took a great deal of strength to maintain. His calls became more frequent, his voice lower, faster, colder. Some nights he didn't come home. Some nights he came home at 3 o'clock in the morning, then sat in his office until dawn. And Tessa began to believe with the cruel logic life had taught her for 27 years, that she was the cause. Pierce Lawton was attacking Conrad because of her. The underworld was laughing because of her. Deals were being canceled because of her. Everything Conrad had built was cracking because of her existence in this house. And if she disappeared, the crack would stop spreading. She was used to that logic. All her life, she had been the one who left so other people could have peace, leaving a foster family so they wouldn't have one more mouth to feed, leaving the shelter to make room for someone else, leaving every place before she could be thrown out, because being thrown out hurt more than leaving on her own. At midnight on the 4th day, Tessa sat on the bed, took a blank sheet of paper from the nightstand drawer, and wrote, "Not much. Only one sentence. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." She folded the paper in half, stepped into the living room, and placed it on the table beside the spot where Conrad usually sat drinking whiskey. Then she returned to her room, took the only small bag she owned, the bag she had brought to the penthouse on the first day with exactly one change of clothes inside, placed a few things she had bought with his bank card into it, then stopped. She looked around the room, at the bed made with white sheets, at the window overlooking the Chicago night sky. Then she zipped the bag shut, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped into the hallway. She passed the reading room, where the tin box sat on the highest shelf, and her footsteps slowed for 1 second before she continued. She passed the office, the door closed, the room dark inside. She reached the end of the hallway, stopped at the elevator doors, and placed her finger on the button. She didn't press it. Her finger rested there, cold and trembling slightly. She stood with the bag on her shoulder, staring at the steel elevator doors reflecting her image back at her. A thin girl in a gray sweater, brown hair tied low, eyes red. She looked exactly like the 19-year-old girl in the police file. Still that same girl. Always the person standing at a threshold preparing to leave somewhere. The bodyguard guarding the penthouse that night was the one who had been with her when the black car followed them. He saw Tessa packing her things that afternoon, saw her write something and place it on the table, saw her carry the bag into the hallway. And he did exactly the one thing he was paid to do. He called Conrad. Conrad was at the Italian restaurant when he received the call. He listened for 3 seconds, stood up in the middle of an unfinished sentence to one of his men, and left the restaurant without taking his coat, even though it was 10 degrees outside. He drove back to the penthouse in 20 minutes, unlocked the door with his key, and stepped into the dark living room. He saw the folded paper on the table, picked it up, opened it, read it. 1 sentence, 13 words. Heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He folded the paper again, slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, then walked quickly into the hallway. His footsteps rang against the stone floor, fast, firm, not running, but urgent in a way Conrad Voss was never urgent for anyone in this world. Tessa heard those footsteps from the end of the hallway. Her finger was still resting on the elevator button. She didn't press it. She stood there, her back turned to him, the bag on her shoulder, and waited. "Where are you going?" Tessa didn't turn around. She stood there with her back to him, her finger still resting on the elevator button, the bag heavy on her shoulder even though there was nothing valuable inside except 3 cheap sets of clothes and 1 pair of shoes. She heard his breathing behind her, faster than usual, and she knew he had come here in a hurry because Conrad Voss never breathed fast unless he had just run or was so angry he couldn't control the rhythm of his breath. "I'm dragging you down." Her voice was low, even, dry, the voice of someone who had cried enough and had no tears left to give. "Everything I touch breaks. It's been that way my whole life. Everywhere I go, I ruin it just by existing, and I don't want to do that to you." Conrad stepped closer. Not quickly, not slowly, just with the stride of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He reached out, gently but firmly, and took the bag from her shoulder. Tessa didn't resist, didn't hold on, only let the bag slide away as if losing something she was already used to losing. Conrad set the bag down on the marble floor, right at their feet, then lifted his hand and placed it against the elevator door. He didn't touch her. He didn't take her hand, didn't hold her shoulder, didn't pull her back. He only placed his palm against the cold steel surface of the elevator door, blocking her only way out with his arm, and stood there. Tessa looked at his arm at eye level, his shirt sleeve rolled up, the muscle of his forearm taut beneath his skin, and she knew she could duck under it, could push his hand away, could press the button and step into the elevator at any moment because he hadn't locked the door. He had only blocked it. He gave her a choice by not taking the choice away, and that hurt more than any locked door could have. "Do you know what I did to get all of this?" Conrad said quietly, his voice closer than she had expected, because he had stepped very near behind her, though she hadn't heard his footsteps. "I told you about my past, about the blood and shadows I used to build all of this." He stopped, and in that pause Tessa heard something she had never heard in Conrad's voice before. A tiny crack, as thin as a strand of hair, yet filled with an undeniable ache. "Everything in this house began with that darkness. I've always accepted being surrounded by monsters, but I never expected to find someone like you." Tessa turned around, slowly, little by little, until she faced him in the narrow hallway between the elevator doors and the wall. The distance between them was only one step. Conrad looked straight at her, the steel blue eyes she had once thought would never change, now completely uncovered, stripping away his usual armor to reveal a vulnerability that hit her harder than any of his cold stares. Not weakness, because Conrad Voss wasn't weak, but truth, bare and uncovered. The kind of truth people only let another person see when they are more afraid of losing that person than of being seen. "If anyone is dragging anyone down here," he said, "it's me." He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice changed, not softer, but slower, more careful, like a man choosing every word because he knew they mattered more than anything he had ever said. "But you still leave warm water for me every night I come home without asking where I've been. You still sit beside me on the sofa when I don't want to say anything without needing me to invite you. You still stayed even though no one forced you to stay, even though no one paid you to stay, even though you could walk out this door at any moment and no one in the world would blame you." Tessa's eyes were red, her lids swollen, but she wasn't crying. She had cried enough in the bedroom over the past 4 days, had wrung herself dry, and what remained inside her now wasn't tears, but a single question lying in her eyes as she looked straight into his. Why did he want her to stay? Conrad read that question because he always read everything in everyone. That was how he had survived, and he answered it with the 2 words he had never thought he would say to anyone again. "Don't go." Not an order, not a request. It was the sound of a man who had grown used to losing everything and had believed there was nothing left he feared losing, until the thin girl in the gray sweater stood at the elevator with a small bag on her shoulder, and he realized that he was afraid. Tessa looked at him, looked for a long time, looked into that unyielding gaze that, for the first time, didn't seem cold, didn't seem burning, only true. Then she looked down at the bag on the floor, then at the elevator button, then back at him. She took her hand off the button. Her hand fell to her side, light, released, like someone finally setting down a weapon not because she had lost, but because she didn't want to fight anymore. She said nothing, didn't say, "I'll stay," didn't say, "Thank you," didn't say anything at all, because words in that moment would have been smaller than the moment itself. She simply took her hand off the button, and that was enough. The bag remained on the marble floor all night. No one picked it up. No one mentioned it. It lay there, small, light, holding everything Tessa Flynn owned in the world. And it stayed there until the next morning, until the next afternoon, until the next week, until it became part of the penthouse like the sofa or the kitchen table, like Tessa herself. Something that had once been preparing to leave, but had finally stayed. In the weeks that followed, Conrad stopped going out at night. He sat in his office with the door closed, but Tessa could hear his voice through the phone. Low, steady, calm, the voice of a man playing a chess game in which he had already seen the checkmate 30 moves earlier. Conrad didn't use his fists to deal with Pierce Lawton this time. He used something far more powerful, something in the Chicago underworld more frightening than any bullet. Information. For years, Pierce Lawton had built his empire on filthy deals he believed no one knew about. Money laundered through shell companies, secret agreements with officials who wore neckties during the day and stood before cameras speaking about justice, numbers hidden inside accounts he thought no one could ever reach. But Conrad had known. Not recently. He had known for a long time, because Conrad Voss hadn't become the man controlling half the south side of Chicago by only knowing how to hold a gun. He held power by knowing everything about everyone and waiting for the right moment to use it. And now was the right moment. The files, the records, the evidence of transactions were sent out in a single night. Not to the police, because in this world the police weren't referees, but to exactly the people Pierce depended on. Partners, suppliers, other bosses Pierce needed in order to survive. Every envelope was a knife wound. Every email was another rope being cut. And when morning came, Pierce Lawton woke up in a world where no one answered when he called. He collapsed not because he had been beaten, but because he had been betrayed by the very system he trusted. And that was the kind of collapse no one ever stood back up from. The articles about Tessa disappeared from the internet within a week. No one publicly took them down. They simply vanished quietly, one article at a time, as though they had never existed. No one dared mention the name Tessa Flynn in any conversation connected to Conrad Voss anymore, because now everyone understood that touching her meant touching him, and touching him meant ending yourself. Tessa didn't know the details. Conrad didn't tell her, and she didn't ask. But she noticed the changes through small signs. Conrad's phone rang less often. His shoulders were less rigid when he stepped out of the elevator each evening. And one afternoon, when he came home, he didn't walk straight into his office the way he usually did. He stopped in the living room where Tessa was sitting with a book she had taken from the library room, looked at her for a moment, then placed a file on the table in front of her. Tessa looked at the file, dark blue hardcover, with the logo of a law firm on it. She opened it. Inside were legal documents. She had to read slowly twice before she understood, because legal language wasn't something she was familiar with. But she understood enough. A petition for custody rights, prepared by Conrad's lawyers. And on the final page, in the section for financial guarantor, Conrad Voss's name had already been filled in, already signed, the ink still fresh. Tessa stared at the file for a long time, a very long time. She read his name on the guarantor line 3 times, because she needed to make sure her eyes weren't deceiving her, that this wasn't a dream she would wake up from inside a winter sedan. Conrad stood beside the table, hands in his pockets, not looking at her but out toward the glass windows, as though what he had just done wasn't something important. "It'll take time," he said in a normal voice, the voice of a man discussing the weather instead of handing a woman the chance to become a mother again. "But if you want to, we'll try." Tessa looked at the file, then at him. She didn't say thank you. Those 2 words were too small for what was flooding through her, too small for the past she had carried for so many years. For the courtroom where she had stood alone with no one beside her, for the nights she lay in the car with her eyes closed, trying to remember the smell of her little girl's hair. She didn't say thank you. She stood up, walked toward him, and hugged him. For the first time since entering the penthouse, Tessa Flynn reached for Conrad Voss first. Not because he pulled her close, not because he lifted her chin, not because circumstances forced them together, but because she wanted to. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressed her face against his chest, held him tightly, and she felt the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt. Conrad stood stiff for 1 second, 1 long second, the reflex of a man who had lived his whole life never allowing anyone close enough to hold him. Then his arms lifted slowly, hesitantly, before circling around her back, pulling her closer, tighter, and holding her there longer than either of them had ever been held in their lives. It was the embrace of a man finally understanding that strength didn't mean being alone, that protecting someone wasn't only blocking an elevator door or erasing articles from the internet, but also letting that person hold him and not stepping away. Spring came to Chicago on a morning without warning. The first warm sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, softer and warmer than every morning before, scattering pale gold across the marble floor, across the kitchen table, across the 2 coffee cups, sitting side by side on the balcony. Tessa stood on the balcony, dark brown hair falling over her shoulders instead of tied low behind her neck, her face turned toward the light. Conrad stood beside her, much closer than on the first morning they had stood there together, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. In the living room behind them, on the bookshelf where the old tin box once sat, there were now 2 photographs standing side by side. The first photograph had yellowed with time. A young woman with long black hair, holding a smiling little boy, tiny hands gripping the collar of his mother's shirt. Conrad had taken that photograph out of the old tin box from the highest shelf and placed it at eye level at some point, though Tessa wasn't sure when. The second photograph was newer, printed on glossy paper. Tessa sitting on the balcony, her face turned toward the light, hair moving gently in the wind, not smiling but looking peaceful in a way she had never looked peaceful before. Taken by Conrad on his phone one morning, when she hadn't known he was watching her. 2 photographs, 2 women who had changed his life, one he couldn't keep, one he would never lose. Conrad and Tessa's story wasn't a fairy tale. No one rode in on a white horse to save anyone. No one was perfect, and no one began with love. They began with a forced marriage, with humiliation, with fear, and with 2 people pushed by life into a corner until they had no one left except each other. But what made their story matter wasn't how it began. It was how they chose to stay. The simplest lesson in the world, and also the hardest, is this. The value of a human being isn't measured by their past, by police records, by the amount of money in their account, or by what other people say about them. The value of a human being lives in how they treat others when no one is watching, in a basin of warm water placed beside a bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, in sitting beside someone who is hurting without demanding an explanation, in the 2 words, "Don't go," spoken in the voice of someone who had forgotten how to ask anyone to stay. And if you're listening to this story on a sleepless night, I want you to remember that being pushed down by life doesn't mean you aren't worthy of love. It only means you haven't yet met the right person willing to stand beside you and say you're not going anywhere. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support our channel. Share this video with the people you love, because they may need to hear this story tonight more than you realize. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new stories every day. We would truly love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Which part touched you the most? Leave a comment below and share what is in your heart. Because every comment you leave is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.